Chapter 13. As Snow White led the bandits through the woods toward the cottage, her heart thudded. Jonathan was hurt, badly. The arrow was lodged deep in his shoulder, and before he passed out, his face had been full of pain. The others were silent as they made their way farther into the woods. The lack of noise worried Snow White almost as much as the occasional groan that slipped from Jonathan's lips. Their silence made clear the danger their leader was in. Spotting a familiar clearing ahead, Snow White sighed with relief. They had arrived. Pushing open the door, she found her 7 friends gathered around the kitchen table. She hadn't stopped to wonder if they might be home, and was thankful they were. As Finch and Mabel placed Jonathan gently down on a table outside, Jonathan led the 7 to him and quickly filled them in on what had transpired. When she got to the part about needing Doc to take out the arrow, she saw him go. Doc is more of a sobriquet rather than a technical title, he said, sweat beading on his forehead. Ugh. Bless me. My true expertise lies in the study of igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic granules. The others stare at him with blank expressions. You know, Doc said, putting on his headlamp and lifting his pickaxe, which he then held nervously in his hands. Rocks. Just then, Jonathan let out another groan of pain. There was no one else who could help. So even if it was in name only, Doc was going to have to step up. The other 6 were currently involved in an intense staring contest with the thieves. Grumpy was standing in the door, acting as guard, with his arms crossed over his chest and a grumpier than usual expression on his face. I'm sorry, Doc went on. I don't think I can help him. Snow White opened her mouth to protest, but Quag beat her to it. I am the rebel Quag, master of the crossbow, and I'm ordering you to save him. We haven't even been introduced yet, Doc said, clearly trying to buy himself time. In alphabetical order, of course. Snow White cut him off. Doc, please, we don't have time, she said, her voice shaking as she looked at Jonathan. His face had grown even paler. He's badly injured. You have to help. But they're bandits, Grumpy called from the doorway. What are you going to do about it? Finch argued from where he stood at the window. Snow White groaned. She was sure that if Jonathan were awake, he would have something to say about that. But as he wasn't, she knew it was up to her to stop any potential brawl between the two groups. The last thing they needed was her 7 friends and the rebels getting into a fight and abandoning any attempt to save Jonathan. Snow White had had enough of everyone bickering. She had had enough of the fighting and the seizing and the running. This wasn't a joke anymore. Jonathan was hurt, and if they didn't focus on that, he was going to die. And then what good would that do? She brought her fingers to her lips and let out a piercing whistle. Instantly, everyone stopped fighting. This is exactly how the Queen would want us to behave, she said, standing tall and keeping her voice even. Snow White thought about all the times she had seen her father address the villagers, reassuring them in times of difficulty and encouraging them in times of joy. Channeling him as best she could, she went on. Fighting each other, distrusting each other. This is how she wins. She gathers strength from weakness, wealth from poverty, beauty from others' lack. She paused to take a breath, the weight of the room on her. Her words were powerful and came from a place of truth and understanding. She had been a victim of the Queen's for far too long. She's poisoned us into believing it's everyone for themselves. But if we can give up our meager scraps, we will inherit what was meant for all of us. And it's more than any of us can imagine. It just requires faith in each other. She stopped and waited, not sure if her words would move any of them. For a long moment, all was silent, save for Jonathan's labored breathing. And then, to her surprise, One of the outlaws dropped to his knee and bowed his head. Grumpy wiped a tear from his eye, and the others gave her reassuring smiles. She had done it. She had convinced them to stop their petty squabbles and focus on the greater good. Now she just needed Doc to save Jonathan. Turning to him, she said, "Help him. Please." Doc sighed before taking off his glasses and wiping them on his shirt. He nodded slowly. "Bring him inside." As the afternoon sunlight slid through the window of the Queen's bedchamber, she sat before her mirror, preening in front of her reflection as she waited for one of her many servants to adorn her with a jewel-encrusted necklace. A heavy knock sounded on her door, and the Queen waved for her servant to answer it. A handful of guards stood in the doorway, their nervousness apparent from the way they fidgeted and shifted their weight. One stepped forward as the Queen looked at them expectantly. "Your Majesty, word from the captain. They found the princess." The Queen turned back to her reflection, all smiles as she stared at her own image. "And where is she now?" she questioned. The pause the soldier gave was long. "It appears she escaped, with the help of the bandits." The Queen's already pale complexion turned even whiter. "The bandits?" she questioned. Her chair scraped across the floor with a loud rasping sound that echoed through the otherwise silent chamber. She stood, her hands clenched into fists as she tried to maintain her poise and composure. "Do you have any idea what this means?" she asked the guards, but she didn't wait on an answer. "She is gathering strength, turning the people against the rightful queen." The Queen took a deep breath as she fought back a tidal wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "Although I can't help but wonder, if they turn against me, what do you think happens to you?" The skirts of her gown swished around her legs as she walked the length of the line of guards, back and forth, looking pointedly at each one of them. "Do you even remember the ugly little lives I saved you from?" she demanded. "Your ugly little farms and your ugly little shops. She'll take away everything I've given you." The Queen stopped right in the middle, getting in the face of the one guard who had stepped forward. "All the power, all the beauty," she sneered. Unable to repress the panic any longer, she began to scream. "Is that what you want?" The sun had begun to sink behind the trees as Doc continued to work on Jonathan. The cottage was thick with tension. The rebels had gone inside, and now they paced along one edge of the table, while the cottage's inhabitants paced along the other. In the middle, bent over his patient, Doc worked on Jonathan's wound. Snow White was exhausted. So much had happened in such a short time. She had left the castle, escaped the huntsman, befriended 7 strangers, evaded the Queen's guards, and encountered the ragtag rebels. And she had gotten to know Jonathan. Despite his bravado, she knew he was a kind and big-hearted man, someone who would put his rebels' needs before his own, someone who would help a stranger like her. Sighing, she slipped through the door of the cottage into the late afternoon light. The trees looked like they were on fire as the setting sun bathed them in its glow. The forest creatures were quiet, also waiting for Jonathan's recovery. Staring at the peaceful scene, Snow White tried to calm her racing heart and mind. "Hot milk?" Turning, Snow White saw Sleepy. He was holding a steamy mug in his hand. She noticed the others had left the cottage too, and now everyone was mingling outside. It helps me sleep. Thank you, she said, taking the mug and giving them a small smile. She was grateful for the distraction, at least. Together they stared into the trees, with Snow White taking occasional sips of the hot drink. Sleepy had been right. It did make her feel calm. Just then, Doc appeared. Spotting Snow White, he moved toward her. She waited, holding back tears. Maple approached and gently put a hand on her shoulder as they waited for the news. Doc removed his hat and held it in his hands. I used the blast furnace to get through the bedrock, he began, then drilled to the fissure core, added a poultice or two, a dose of acentum saturnium acid of sulfur dosified. Snow White stared at him. He was speaking in gibberish. Had he saved Jonathan or not? She was about to ask when suddenly Jonathan appeared in the doorway. Well, that was unpleasant, he said. He was bandaged in a rather odd way, and he looked confused. But he was alive. I thought he was dead, Doc admitted to himself. The clearing erupted in cheers as everyone let out shouts of joy at seeing Jonathan on his feet. The bandits quickly surrounded their captain, hugging him gently and welcoming him back. The miners did the same, only they surrounded Doc, giving him hugs and congratulating him on a job well done. Jonathan didn't know whether to collapse or cry or both. Seeing Jonathan filled her with happiness, and before she knew what was she doing, she found herself rushing toward him. She was about to throw her arms around him when she stopped herself, suddenly aware of the audience. Then she looked at her 7 friends. Thank you, Doc. Doc shrugged, but looked quite pleased with himself. Of course, he said, I would do anything for Snow White's special friend. Dozens of eyes turned and stared at Jonathan and Snow White. She felt heat rise on her cheeks and was happy to see Jonathan's ears turn red. Oh, no, she protested. What? No, Jonathan said at the same time. They continued to stumble over each other's words, trying to show just how little it mattered to them, while everyone watched with smug smiles on their faces. Would have done, Snow White said. Exactly, Jonathan interrupted. For anyone. Nothing to do with you, she said with a groan. Jonathan nodded. Right. Run-of-the-mill kindness. Totally non-specific. Snow White looked at him. Nothing to do with you, with him. Snow White had the sudden urge to find a cave to hide in. She wished that the ground underneath her would open, or that a flock of birds would appear in the sky, swoop down, and fly her away. This was wildly embarrassing, and she wasn't entirely sure she was all that pleased with Jonathan's displeasure at the idea she might have helped him specifically. But then again, she was trying to make it clear it wasn't anything special. Stepping between them, Happy looked back and forth between Jonathan and Snow White. He didn't seem at all bothered by the obvious tension between the two. Instead, he seemed pleased. A huge smile spread across his face. Oh, isn't this just wonderful, he said, clapping his hands together. You know what time it is, fellas? Snow White shook her head. To her annoyance, so did Jonathan. While neither of them had any inkling what time it was, Grumpy clearly did. And he clearly did not like it. His eyes darted toward the thick trees, like he was thinking of making a run for it. Please, no, he begged. In answer, the sound of a guitar filled the clearing. Snow White turned and saw that Sneezy had pulled out the instrument and was slowly strumming it. The sound was lovely, twinkling like the stars that had begun to appear in the evening sky. Still smiling, Happy pulled out a flute, while Bashful appeared with a harmonica, though he quickly hid so no one could actually see him play. It's time to dance, Sneezy declared. As Snow White watched with growing delight, an impromptu celebration began. Everyone joined in, eager to let loose after a tense day. The music grew louder as a makeshift dance floor was set up in the clearing. In one corner, Sneezy and the bandit named Bingley played the piano they had dragged outside, accompanied by Finch on the guitar. Those who weren't playing instruments began to dance a merry jig, the sound of their tapping shoes on the ground adding to the lively beat of the music. In the rush and frenzy of the dance, Snow White found herself pulled away from Jonathan. He was taken to the far side of the clearing, where he was surrounded by miners and rebels, the center of attention as he entertained them with the story of his heroic rescue and the pain of his wound. Every so often his gaze drifted to her, and their eyes met for a moment. But then Snow White, or Jonathan, looked away. Hoping to distract herself from the riotous feelings filling her head and heart, Snow White focused on the dancers. Maple and Quig had quickly taken center stage and were sharing a jig in the middle of the room. Both were smiling broadly, the picture of happiness as they moved about the dance floor, lost in the music. Snow White couldn't help smiling herself as she saw the absolute joy in their faces. She felt that strange pang again. She had never really given much thought to dancing and music and all those things. They hadn't been a part of her life for so long. But now, seeing these two and feeling Jonathan's eyes on her, she wondered what it would be like to dance with such abandon. Spotting Snow White, Quig joined her. "You and Maple are fine dancers," Snow White said. Quig blushed. "We're just friends," he said, taking off his hat and nervously wringing it in his hands. "Right," Snow White said. "You know," Quig coughed, "like you and Jonathan." This time it was Snow White who blushed. "I'm pretty sure Jonathan only cares about himself," Snow White said, but her words sounded hollow, even to her. She couldn't deny that there was something between them. "Is that why you took an arrow for you?" Quig asked. Snow White's eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open. "What?" she asked, shaking her head. He couldn't mean that she thought he meant. He couldn't mean what she thought he meant. Jonathan had been hit by an arrow meant for him, hadn't he? "We all saw it," Quig said. "That selfish, no-good thief. He saved your life." When his earth-shattering news dropped, Quig shrugged and walked away. Snow White's head was spinning. If what Quig had said was true, and there was no reason for him to lie to her, so she had to assume it was. Jonathan had protected her, risking his own life. So when he said that he was just doing something ordinary, he had been lying. Because no one stepped in front of an arrow for just anyone. So that meant, could he truly care for her? She saw that Jonathan and Dopey were now chasing fireflies. Dopey held a jar in his hand as he tried to catch one. Jonathan's face glowed in the soft light created by the bugs. A warm feeling flooded through her as she watched them. When she left the castle, she had assumed that her journey would be a lonely one, that she would have to face the road alone, dodging shadows and trudging along pathways without anyone beside her. And then she had met the seven, and a piece of her heart had begun to hope that maybe things could be different, that she could find a place outside the castle where she belonged. And the feeling had only grown when she found the strength to continue on her journey, to find the rebels and get answers. She had felt herself coming alive when she faced off against the band in the beginning, and then felt even more energized as she and Jonathan bickered over who would help whom. Until then, she realized she had been asleep, walking through her life in a daze, and not ever really noticing the world around her. Yet ever since she entered the woods, she had been awake. Staring at Jonathan, she realized that she had set out to find her father and return to the castle, to the way things had been. But now she wasn't sure she wanted that at all. As if pulled by some invisible string, She found herself moving closer and closer to Jonathan. Okay. Their eyes locked, and she saw something flash in his. An understanding? A spark? I will. Moving away from Dopey, he walked toward her until they met. For a long moment, they simply stood there, inches apart, eyes still locked. Snow White had never felt like this before. Like Jonathan could help her live her dreams. Like he could make her world brighter. And now, this close, she could see that perhaps Quake hadn't been wrong. That Jonathan cared for her too. She leaned forward. Jonathan did the same. Hi, they said at the same time, meeting in the middle. They were unaware that the music had stopped and that they were being watched by all their friends, frozen in anticipation of what might happen next. That was when a loud trumpet sounded in the distance.